Hello, guys. Welcome to another episode of Open Source Sailing. Actually, why another episode? This is the first episode. And in Open Source Sailing, we want to take a look at the most interesting open source projects on GitHub and how these projects help you as an architect, as a developer in the cloud native area to develop nice apps. And today we want to take a look at Spring Cloud Kubernetes. As the name already says, Spring and Kubernetes are some very widely adopted technologies, and this Spring Cloud Kubernetes is actually a library for your Spring application, which makes your application aware of what's happening in Kubernetes, of the instances and objects inside a Kubernetes cluster, for example, to configure your app based on config maps. And this is the example we want to examine today together. So we will have an example app, a Spring application serving some endpoint, and this endpoint will have different outputs depending on where it's running. And for this configuration, we will use config maps. We have a repository here. It's my personal repository, Gradle Gib, inside my GitHub account. And you can clone this, of course, to just do these steps which I'm doing here. All these steps I will also do are documented inside the README file, so feel free to just follow me. Let's take a look first at the app itself. So we have here a pretty normal Spring Boot application, and what makes it now a little bit more special is this dependency here, which is the Spring Cloud Kubernetes config dependency, which allows us to configure our Spring app based on config map resources inside Kubernetes. Besides the other folders in the repository here, we have the source folder. So all the other folders like Helm and Gradle, we might take a look at in some other videos, but today we want to really look at what the app is doing and how it can read configuration inside Kubernetes. So we have some main application which is running the Spring app, and our controller here is actually serving on slash as a request path, and when this request path is used, it will provide an output. And this some output here, it's retrieved from a value inside our Spring configuration. We are using here an application YAML to configure our app, and in this example we have this string here which is given as soon as we request the controller. So let's run the app locally to examine the output of this app when it's configured with the local application YAML. I'm using here Atom with a Gradle plugin. Can highly recommend it. It's really a very nice and especially lightweight IDE. And yeah, what we are getting here is hello from local Glühbirnenkopf. So this is whatever is configured in the local configuration of our app. And we want to now deploy our app to Kubernetes and see how we can change this to be read from some external property. Because also, to give you some more background, the main reason is, of course, to configure your app based on environments, and you don't want to have, of course, same configurations or configurations in general hard-coded into your source code or part of your source code. So we need to somehow distinguish here between runtime configuration and build time configuration, and the runtime configuration should be somewhere inside your cluster, and you just deploy your artifact there and it will get the respective configuration. So we have some access to a Kubernetes cluster. There's currently running simply nothing. You can of course reproduce this also with your with a local Kubernetes Minikube, or also on OpenShift with Minishift, whatever. So the first step we need to get our app inside the cluster is to have an image, and I'm using here some Google project which is called Yeah, Jib, Java Image Builder. The nice thing about Jib is it will give us the possibility to build Docker images without actually having a Docker daemon. Docker daemon is still running here on my machine as I want to be able to execute also my Docker containers. But the nice thing is really that you don't need a Docker engine running for building. Maybe some other video from me will cover this topic. So when we have our image built, then we will deploy it to the cluster. And to do so, as said, we have here some steps. So the first thing we actually want to do is we want to create our config map for our app, which should contain the key message text and the value hello from Glühbirnenkopf in the cloud. So ideally, this is the property which Spring will automatically read, and as it's message.text, which our Spring app already knows and our REST controller also addresses at the value annotation, it will print out this string hopefully. So let's do this first. So inside our cluster we will create this config map. Oh yeah, I have not deleted it actually from last time. So let us take a look at this config map, how it looks like. So this command here will actually create this config map for you with the name hello world, and it will contain this data here, key value. And now we want to deploy our Spring app to the cluster and see what it does. So this is the image I have built right now, and we will deploy it. And of course, if you are a little bit familiar with Kubernetes, every deployment creates hopefully some pods, and we have here our application. Let's check the logs. And what we see here is, we see some errors, some stack traces. So the Spring Cloud starter actually tries to initiate Spring Cloud Kubernetes, and it complains about service account and role-based access control. So in general, it has no permissions. So as you can see it here, forbidden. Our configured service account inside Kubernetes doesn't have access to read several resources. Here it complains about pods inside the namespace default. And you can refer to the documentation of Spring Cloud Kubernetes. Actually, if you deploy your Spring app to the cluster, it will need some permissions to read the resources we have created. For example, this config map which we have created, it needs to be read, and your app needs to be allowed to read this config map. And this is also one of the tricky things. So when you first start with this stuff, you need to first be aware and create all this stuff. So as a first action here, we will create the service account. So we will create a service account with the name hello world, and we will create a role for our Spring Cloud configuration. It should be able to get, watch, and list config maps, pods, as well as secrets. And with this role in place, we can also create a role binding, which will actually combine the service account and the role. It will map those together so that our service account gets the role we have just created. So now our service account hello world has all the permissions it will need. And the last thing we need to do is now that we need to patch our deployment to use this new service account. And as soon as I patch a deployment, Kubernetes will automatically roll out the changes. So we can see that my old app here is terminating and my new app is already up and running. I mean, it's still starting. We don't have health checks here, but we will see what it does. And we can see no stack traces or exceptions. We can see here that Spring is loading the config map hello world inside the namespace default. So everything went fine. And we now want to prove what our app is serving. So for this, we will expose it. On port 8080. And as I don't have an ingress here on this free cluster, we need to do port forwarding. Port forward. And I will forward my traffic to this service via port 8080. So now from my local machine, I should be able to access this pod in the cloud. And we can see we get a new response now. Hello from Glühbirnenkopf in the cloud, which was our string we have configured inside the config map. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. So you can actually, as an operator or in general as a developer, place your config maps inside the cluster or deploy them via some process, and then your app will automatically use whatever configuration is in there, and you will have independence from your for all your running apps in terms of artifact and configuration, running configuration. The last thing I want to mention here is, if you want to get into it, read the docs. There's a lot of more things possible, like also secrets. So you can imagine not everything is configuration, but you might have also some passwords which you want to configure, and they are maybe a little bit more secure, or should be more secure and not exposed to everyone. So that's why this Kubernetes, Spring Cloud Kubernetes, also understands secrets. Same procedure there, you create secrets, reference them, that's it. Feel free to star my repository, of course, and so on. So I hope you enjoyed this first episode of Open Source Sailing, and let's see which repository comes up next here. Bye bye, see you then.